Okay. All right, guys. So before we start today, any questions, any comments about class material, about your paper, about some of the readings, about some of the videos that are posted on Canvas, anything, any questions or comments?
When is our paper due? I forgot the date.
The due date for the paper, is that what you asked?
Yes.
Ah, you got me there. Anybody has that information handy?
It's in the syllabus. I think it's early May.
I believe it's May 3rd.
It's May 3rd.
Yep, May 3rd.
Okay.
Thank you, guys. There you have it, David. Good question. Yeah, like I said about the paper, I've had some conversations with some of you. I think some of you are doing really well, like a third of you. The others, I have no idea. I haven't talked to you about that. So again, if you need any guidance, any assistance, let me know. I'll be happy to provide it. But again, the people I talk to, I think it's in good shape. So I'm not that concerned. All right. So no questions, no comments. All right. We get Dylan in. Cody, you still have your hand up. Is a remnant from before, or you have another question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a little bit about remittances. So in the recorded lecture, you talked about the programs that were in Mexico that had to do with remittances. What was the sort of explanation for why Mexico couldn't just invest these dollars on their own, that they had to be sort of incentivized to do it with other through remittances? Because I mean, obviously they're kind of implying that they have the money sitting there and available for the programs. So I'm a bit confused why they need the remittance dollars.
Okay, good question, Cody. So yes, the remittances, think about those. They come to individual families in Mexico. And sometimes they cover a very large amount of land, even within a given locality. You know, you think about a state or a community, it's all over the place. So the remittances belong to families. So number one, as I explained in the recording, the remittances typically are used for consumption. So they pay bills, they pay food, they buy clothes, things like that. So in the mind of these people, the recipients, investing for business opportunities is not in their minds in general. So that's the first part of the answer. The second part of the answer is you're absolutely right. And I don't remember if I made this point or not. If the state and or the federal government have, you know, the matching capability for the 1-for-2 or the 3-for-1, 1-for-3 program, you know, why do they need this additional, you know, $1 or two, right, from the remittances? Well, the point again, I don't remember if I made this or not, made this point or not, is that I think you're right. I mean, this is supposed to be the responsibility of the state, because those families receiving the remittances are taxpayers already. They pay income tax, sales tax, property tax, just like we do in any other, you know, developed country. So the reason I think this is happening is because, at least this is what some politicians in Mexico argue, is that they want people to have some, you know, forgive the expression, some skin in the game, so that they chip in with something, so that they value the road, so that they value the school, so that they value the, you know, basketball court, and obviously, you know, if they can, in the case of the 2-for-1, you know, doubling, you know, they can double the amount of money by, you know, joining forces. Well, that's a huge incentive for the government. You know, they don't have to pay in full. They only pay half or a third, state, federal, and the remittances part. So I don't know if this answered your questions, Cody. I think you have a good point. I don't understand why this was necessary. When in fact this is supposed to be a responsibility of the state to provide public goods and services in the first place. Now remember, in some cases where the state is absent, completely absent. I'm talking about remote localities in Mexico specifically, but also in places like Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, but specifically in Mexico. When there is a gap, a vacuum of leadership, and there is no provision of public goods and services, many of these people in these communities feel abandoned. And many of them rely on agriculture. And I think I explained this already, that this gap, this void, is not uncommon to see being filled by illegal activities. So people in need of land to produce crops that can be used to produce drugs and being very lucrative, they just go to these localities and they say, hey, where is the government? Well, there is no government around. Or what do you need, guys? Well, we need a school, we need roads, we need all these public services. And these guys say, well, what about if you switch your crop from whatever you're planting right now? We are going to give you the seeds, we're going to give you all the technical assistance that you want. We are going to build these things that you need in terms of public services. We are going to provide protection. All you need to do is to grow these things and give us the output. So this is a very scary proposition and very scary scenario, because this is not an isolated event in this particular area. This is happening in multiple locations, right? So again, I'm just mentioning this because it's part of the equation. If the government doesn't establish some presence, somehow the void is going to be occupied by somebody else. And that somebody else is not necessarily, coming from a legal perspective. We're talking about illicit activities, right? I think I'm going to stop here. Cody.
Yeah, I guess in my mind, given that a lot of Latin American institutions and tax sort of systems aren't really established, at least the way they are here in the US. I'm not sure what the scenario is in Mexico, but I imagine it's similar to some of the other countries. I guess in my mind, I was trying to come up with some sort of a justification for it. And I guess it kind of seemed a way for the government to sort of bolster revenue in a way, since they don't really have that tax revenue coming in. And they could sort of, this is a way to incentivize people to contribute without sort of forcing sort of income taxes and other tax reforms that maybe the people won't really be partial to, especially because they don't trust the government to either use it well or not just sort of pocket the money. I was wondering if maybe that's an option,
well,
or a possible reason why.
It is possible, but also keep in mind that the motivation, at least in some of these programs in some of these states, is to move the use of remittances away from consumption towards investment, business investment. So if you want to open up a tool shop, or a auto mechanic shop, or a painting shop, or a small restaurant, the idea is that, once again, instead of consuming all these remittances, that although they produce a multiplier effect and they produce tax revenue, in the mind of the federal government and the state government in Mexico, it would be probably, according to some studies produced in the literature, it would be more beneficial to divert these to business, a more productive use of the remittances, where the idea is to pursue this self-reliance. So if they consume on a weekly basis or a monthly basis every dollar that they receive in remittances, there is no growth. It's just consumption. And of course, like I said, poverty is reduced, they satisfy immediate needs, and it's a good thing. But if instead they would be investing at least some of these remittances in some sort of business, if they are successful, if they are legal, they are under the supervision of the authorities and all that, the idea is to pursue this self-reliant goal, where eventually, again, if the business picks up, they are going to rely less and less and less on remittances. They are going to become part of a formalized economy. They are going to generate corporate tax revenue, all of these elements that are more in the realm of a modern economy. So that's the other aspect that you need to consider, Cody, that, I mean, the motivation and the justifications are not one, but multiple layers. And I think this is important to consider. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Good question, though. Thank you. I'm glad some of you are watching the recording, so that's a good thing. All right. Any other? We switch pages in case I don't see a hand or, okay. Okay, guys, so let me now move on to share my screen. Today, we are going to start a brand new section that basically actually contains 3 interrelated sections: agriculture, human resources development or human capital development, and labor markets. So 3 things in one. And the reason I'm doing this is because obviously they are interrelated, and the complexity of these topics is such that require to speak about these 3 things at once, okay? So I am going to try my best to separate them so that you don't get confused, and I'm gonna try my best to explain this because, believe me, it's quite complicated. Right now, I hope that by now you have a good, I don't know, 30,000 feet view of what happened in Latin America. You know, we pursue this economic historical review, and we are around the 2010s right now. But now, what I am going to do now is to deep down a little bit, to drill further in these 3 topics: agriculture, human capital, and labor markets in Latin America, to explain, I hope even better, what's happening today in contemporaneous Latin America, right? So this is the whole political economy in a historical context, but drilling down in these 3 particular topics. Okay, so let's start with agriculture. Ag in Latin America is hugely complex and very unique. You know, just to give you an idea of what I mean by this. In ag, you have at least 4 different markets that operate at the same time: market for land, market for labor, market for capital, and the market for technology. So when you think about land, I'm talking about, you know, we already mentioned property rights, productivity of the land, erosion, depletion of natural resources, you know, pollution, all of these things, just land, right? Then you move on into labor. Think about migration, think about skills, think about the human capital component, think about unionization, think about child labor, feminization of labor. Okay, I can go on and on and on that one. Capital, that involves, you know, the development of the markets necessary to finance the land. It's also about multinational corporations investing in ag in Latin America, rates of return. Okay, technology. Well, if you start mechanizing, like we have, like as we, you know, we are doing this in the valley, we start mechanizing the agriculture. Well, you are going to be displacing a significant amount of labor. But it's not just about that type of technology. I'm talking about biotechnology, genetically modified seeds, intellectual property, and many other things that have to do with technology. So right there, I mean, just in the first, you know, arrow right here, I think you can have a glimpse of the complexity of just ag in Latin America, right? So In Latin America, you essentially have what later we are going to describe as a dualistic structure. Dual, two. So the first group is a large number of traditional farmers that have land, but is not very productive. I am going to define this later more formally. But I'm talking about two sectors, the traditional farming sector, peasant farmers, very low productivity land, no access to capital, no access to technology, very few skills, and so forth. And on the other hand, you have corporate farming. This is large extensions of land owned by a few families or a few or one corporation, very productive land. They have access to technology, distribution channels, marketing channels, access to capital, all of these things, right? So keep that in mind, because this is going to produce, once again, one of the reasons behind income and wealth inequality in Latin America. You have a large number of small peasant traditional farmers and a very small number of very large corporate farmers. You know, think about that. Okay, now here is another interesting challenge, and I think this is important for you to understand, guys. The agricultural sector in Latin America has to produce, obviously, for local consumption, but also for exports. So yes, in Latin America, there is abundant labor, there is abundant land. So obviously Latin America has a comparative advantage in the production of agriculture, raw materials, right? Including, you know, fishery and others. The point is that has to produce for both local and international markets. But here is the catch, What is the proper balance in terms of price so that ag can achieve two important goals? The price of agricultural goods has to be low enough to be competitive in international markets, while at the same time has to be high enough to generate enough income for farmers. You see this sandwich effect? You understand this challenge? So you want to be able to produce at a very low price to be competitive in international markets. But if the price is too low, it may not be enough to generate enough income to those producing those bananas, those pineapples, or whatever you're talking about in agriculture in Latin America. So this is a huge challenge for farmers, because when they face competition, either international competition or domestic competition by, you know, locals or multinational corporations, they are forced to, well, utilize the land more in a more irresponsible way. So this implies deforestation, erosion, depletion of the nutrients of the land. But not only that, this includes the use of fertilizer, pesticides, and many things that are not necessarily in the best interest of, well, the good itself, nature, the health of the farmers. You know, the idea is to raise yield, to increase the productivity of the land, to face what, you know, the corporate farmers can do. They have access, like I said, to all the technology, not just fertilizers, pesticides, but also the bioengineering. So this is a huge challenge for them. And again, this right now, I'm just giving you an introduction, right? We are going to keep talking about this. The idea right now is to just to give you a glimpse of what's happening here. If you remember, because of the imposition of the Washington Consensus and neoliberal policies, the idea behind those is that Latin America, as I said before, is supposed to be specializing in the production and exports of raw materials, including ag. So, you know, this has been one of the main engines of growth. The idea is that Latin America is supposed to be using this abundant land and abundant labor, the variety of climates and all this productivity in the land to produce all this ag stuff, sell it in the international markets, generate the foreign exchange, and then with those monies buy whatever else Latin America is not producing, manufacture goods, services, or you name it. But here is another huge problem for Latin America that I already briefly touched upon. Well, a problem composed by two issues. One, rich economies totally against the rules of the WTO, World Trade Organization, practice what it's called tariff escalation. So the idea is that, I think I already explained this before, and one example is best to understand this. So the idea is to limit Latin American countries to add value to raw materials, because the profit margin, the actual money-making source, is in the value added, not in the product itself. So if you are selling peanuts, you make some money. But if you are making peanut butter, you know, after it's already put in the jar with the label and all of these things, you make a lot more money. Oranges and orange juice, tomato and tomato sauce, you get the idea. Oil or gasoline, right? So the idea is that rich countries like the US, Japan, Canada, and other European countries increase the level of tariffs, the taxes they charge to developing countries, if the value added of the product increases. So for example, the US is telling Mexico, okay, you can sell me all the tomatoes that you want, and the tariff is going to be zero. No taxes, we welcome your tomatoes. Because the US is going to produce the tomato sauce that later we are going to sell back to Mexico. And if Mexico tries to do that, so Mexicans, the Mexican business people are going to say, well, no, that's not a good deal. We are going to start producing tomato sauce ourselves. Fine, you can do whatever you want. It's a free country, it's a free market economy. Well, apparently, that's what we preach, right? But what happens is that the US is going to say, wait a second, Mexican guys, if you want to sell me, the US, tomato sauce, there is going to be a tariff of 10%, 20%, whatever. You guys want to sell me peanut butter? No way, there is a tariff. Orange juice? No, we need to protect our, orange producers in Florida or whatever, right? So this is called tariff escalation. The higher the value added, the higher the tariff it goes. That's one problem. That's one problem. Second problem that Latin America faces in terms of agriculture, subsidies. I don't have in mind right now the size of the farm bill. I don't know if you are familiar with this, the farm bill. It's in the trillions of dollars that, every number of years, the US Congress passes. And there is a large percentage of that bill that goes to subsidies, farming subsidies, many of which land here in the Valley. We subsidize many things, from fertilizers to technical assistance. In some cases, we actually pay farmers not to grow stuff. Anyway, we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. In this box on the screen, you can see that according to the World Bank, rich countries are helping their farmers with around $350 billion a year in subsidies, which is 7 times larger the amount of international aid. So obviously, when the US or Canada or Germany is speaking about international aid, this is a pure gift to poor countries. They say, they go to the newspaper, they want to make a big deal out of it because we are helping our fellow, human beings in despair. Fantastic, that makes the news. But how many people know that the same country is spending 7 times more in helping their own farmers with subsidies? Now you may be thinking, what's the big deal? I mean, actually, I have to be sensitive to this issue because we are here in the Valley, a very ag-based type of community, a very ag-based centric economy, right? But it is what it is. We receive a lot of subsidies, and this is what happens. I am going to play a video in a couple of minutes so that you can, I'm going to let another person explain this probably better with some evidence and some ideas that he can explain good. But there is something called dumping, D-U-M-P, dumping. And this is a very clearly defined concept in the rules of international trade in the World Trade Organization, the WTO. So dumping takes place when one country is selling in another country a good or service below cost. So think about this. Let's suppose that the real cost of producing 1 metric ton of corn in the US, the real cost, I'm totally making this up, I have no idea. Let's suppose is $1,000. But the subsidy that the US farmer is receiving drops the cost from the real 1,000 to an artificial, say, $500. It costs the cost in half. Then the US is able, this American farmer is able to sell 1 metric ton of corn in Mexico for $750. The US farmer is making money because he's receiving the subsidy, but at the same time, obviously he's able to place 1 metric ton of corn in Mexico below the real cost. So what you think, the point I'm trying to make is that these subsidies create an artificial competitiveness. And when you do that, the US is dumping corn in Mexico, what do you think is going to happen in the corn industry in Mexico? Clearly, the Mexican government or any other government in Latin America doesn't have the capability, the resources to respond with a similar subsidy, with a similar assistance to the farming sector. They don't have access to this. So the competition is totally unfair because the US farmer is receiving aid from the US government and therefore is capable of driving Mexican corn growers totally out of competition. And this happens with rice, beans, sorghum, you name it. It's all over the place. It's all cotton. There is a very famous case of cotton, which actually Brazil contested before the WTO. I can tell you the story later. Well, the point is, between tariffs, subsidies, and exchange rates that are beyond the scope of the class, agriculture in Latin America faces huge distortions. So we in the US and the Canadians and the German and the Japanese and everybody running the WTO, they preach free international trade. But that's an illusion. It doesn't happen that way. There is subsidies and there are tariffs. Can you contest these things? Can you file a complaint against the WTO, which is supposed to be the dispute resolution system, the international supra entity where you can bring your concerns? Yes, you can. Everybody can. The problem, and again, we can discuss this in the conversation, is that, remember, the WTO, like the IMF and the World Bank, are not very democratic institutions. They are governed by the most powerful members who happen to be the ones committing the most violations against the rules they create. Brazil was, as far as I know, the only country that was successful in bringing a lawsuit against the US because they demonstrate, and there was irrefutable evidence, and this is why they won the case, that the subsidies to cotton, some of which actually came here to the Valley, because here in the Valley we also produce a little bit of cotton, So the Brazilians complained and they won the case. Of course, the US government appealed, and it was, I don't know, like 7-8 years. There is an NPR Planet Money podcast about this, and many, you can actually search Brazil, cotton, WTO, or something like that, and you are going to have a huge amount of links. The point is, yes, you can, Latin American countries can dispute all of these things, but generally they lose. The evidence they need to demonstrate, the time it takes to get to the courts and the time it gets to get a resolution, it's so long that by the time this happens, the industries, many of the complainers, they get bored, or they exhaust their resources, not just legal recourses, but actually monetary financial resources to pursue these legal lawsuits, and they abandon the enterprise. Anyway, I really want to play this clip, and I want you to see it with me, because I think this could generate some good conversation. It's like 8 minutes long. Timothy, I forgot his last name. Anyway, the guy that you're gonna see in the video is an authority in these issues regarding ag and food around the world, from Tufts University, and is about 10 years old, which is okay, because the study that he's talking about focuses, centers on the effect of NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, on agriculture in Mexico, specifically corn. So anyway, I'm gonna let him talk, but first let me find it very quick. All right, let's see, share. I wanna go here. All right, let me maximize my volume. Oh, you know what? I forgot to, sorry. I need to click on one more button. Share sound, that's the one. Let's hope it works. Here it goes.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay.
How's the volume? Is the volume good?
Yeah, we can hear it.
Yes,
Alright.
it's perfect.
All right, thank you.
Tufts University in Boston. As we discussed in an earlier segment in the immigration debate, not a heck of a lot gets discussed about why the Mexican economy is in such lousy shape. Now joining us to talk about the role of American agribusiness in the Mexican economy is Timothy Wise. He's director of the Research and Policy Program at the Global Development and Environment Institute at Tufts University. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
So talk about how American agribusiness dumps food in Mexico.
Well, I did a recent study that looked for the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington that looked at asked the simple question: to what extent have U.S. agricultural policies, agricultural subsidies, and other forms of support given to U.S. agriculture, what effect have those had on Mexican farmers, with exports increasing dramatically to Mexico from the United States under NAFTA? We looked at 8 products, 8 different 5 crops and 3 meats, and that have all seen huge increases in exports. And
which crops, which meats?
We looked at corn, soy, wheat, cotton, rice, and then we looked at pork, chicken, and beef. All have seen dramatic increases in exports from all over 100%, some as high as 700% increases.
Increases during the period post-NAFTA?
From the early 90s until recent years, which is basically the NAFTA period. And all of those are products that in one form or another get significant support from the U.S. government.
In terms of farm subsidies.
Farm subsidies and other sorts of policies. So we calculated what we call the dumping margin, that is the extent to which U.S. exports are leaving the country and being sold at prices below their actual production costs in the United States. That's one of the definitions of dumping under the World Trade Organization.
And they do that to wipe out local competition? Is that the main objective?
Well, they do that. The U.S. government is doing that, is subsidizing those products in part to provide very cheap products to agribusiness, because it's the raw materials for agribusiness, both in the United States and in Mexico. The exports go because the United States is looking, U.S. companies are looking for market share and looking to expand their market share in Mexico, and NAFTA gave them that opportunity by decreasing protection.
So when you say below the cost of production, it's because of the subsidies.
Because of the subsidies, and it's actually more complicated than that because of a variety of other policies that essentially encourage overproduction of, say, corn. So corn is probably the most important example here because it's such an important
So
product.
what did this do to Mexico? What did you find?
Well, so what we found was that in the case of corn, corn was going into Mexico at 19% below the cost of production in the 9-year period we looked at, 1997 to 2005. And that cost Mexican corn farmers $6.6 billion over 9 years. That's $700 million a year. And if you figure it out on a per acre basis, just sort of what does that mean to a Mexican farmer, it's more than the value of the basic Mexican subsidy program to those farmers. So it's a devastating loss, and one that is clearly owes to U.S. policy.
So you have public money used to help subsidize American agribusiness, who are then dumping products, destroying Mexican agriculture. So they're making money on both ends because they're capturing the Mexican market.
That's right, and it wasn't just corn. I mean, we found overall that the cost to Mexican farmers were $12.8 billion over this 9-year period. And to put that in perspective, from the development perspective for Mexico, that's $1.4 billion a year. That's more than the value of the entire tomato export market from Mexico to the United States, NAFTA's greatest agricultural success story, and 10% of the value of the entire Mexico's entire set of agricultural exports to the United States. So it's a huge loss for Mexico.
So on the agricultural side, it's been a net loss to Mexico, free trade. The theory was they were going to start manufacturing goods because labor was cheaper and more manufacturing would develop and access to the U.S. market would help industrialize Mexico. So did that happen?
That happened to a small extent. They did increase the size of their manufacturing economy. They increased their manufacturing exports to the United States. They did not create very many jobs in that process. And now a lot of those jobs and operations that were created are under threat, have either already moved to China in search of even cheaper wages, or they're under threat to move to China.
So did it create cheaper food in Mexico? I mean, is there any net benefit in this to Mexico?
In theory, the net benefit to Mexico would have been that all food got cheaper, or all of these agricultural raw materials got cheaper. They did get cheaper. The extent to which that was passed on to Mexican consumers is widely questioned. The corn flour market for tortillas in Mexico is controlled 90% by 2 companies. They were 2 companies that came out of the breakup of the government monopoly on basic grains marketing, and they are widely considered to manipulate prices.
These are Mexican-owned companies?
These are Mexican-owned companies.
So you wind up having U.S. agribusiness controls the farming side of it, and the breaking up of the what used to be a lot of state-owned enterprises into privately owned enterprises. You now wind up with such monopolization that they're able to manipulate the markets.
You get the big grain traders from the U.S., Cargill, ADM, and others, interlocking corporate relationships with some of the biggest traders in Mexico. And they're clearly in a position, certainly with their market power, to capture the gains from those low commodity prices and not pass them on to consumers.
So supposed liberalization of trade and liberalization of Mexican law as regard to business actually just led to more monopolization and concentration of ownership.
It definitely led to that, and the other thing it led to, which is has now raised much greater concerns with in recent years, the rise in commodity prices and tortilla riots in Mexico.
Well, that was my next question. So what are Mexicans doing about this?
Well, the issue of food dependency, the dependency for basic food products on imported goods is of grave concern, because it's gotten much worse since NAFTA. In corn, it went from relying for 7% of Mexicans' corn relying on imports to now 34% comes from imports. And so a disruption in the import supply and corporate control over those supplies, which allows them to manipulate the markets, can result in dramatic price swings.
So
for
is this
consumers.
likely, is a real counter policy to this likely to be a big issue in coming Mexican elections?
It could be. It could well be. The agricultural dynamics in Mexico are still very much a live issue. And when I was in Mexico in September speaking to one of the larger independent farm groups, they're as strong as ever and as vociferous as they've ever been in demanding a change in these sorts of policies.
All right, guys. So before I open this up for conversation, really quick, I want to make a point. You probably remember I have mentioned the importance of institutions as part of the economic development process. Get this. In the US, we've had the antitrust regulations since at least 1890, the Sherman Act. In 1914 is the Clayton Act. 1914 is the FTC Act. These are the police institutions of the market, the ones that regulate that a particular company doesn't monopolize or they don't control the price and things like that. Well, so in Latin America, you have this series of policies, neoliberal policies promoted or imposed, some may say, by neoliberal multilateral institutions. So they start talking about opening up on international trade, liberalize and all that. But one of the key elements that was missing, at least in Mexico, was a similar regulation for antitrust. It was just, I believe, until 1996, 2 years after NAFTA, that finally the Mexican Congress passed some law which is very similar to the antitrust regulations in the US. We're talking about 100 years later. And because of that, obviously, when the state-owned enterprises were privatized, and this is what Mr. Weiss, Dr. Weiss is talking about, the state monopoly was broken into two private entities that now control the vast majority of the corn flour in Mexico. So, and of course now I guess there is a way using the law to break up this duopoly, but it hasn't happened because the institution, the law, is so new that very few people know how to use it. There is no legal precedent and many other complications. The point is, I just wanted to take this opportunity to illustrate one very good example of a key missing institution in the process. Anyway, let's open up for this for a conversation. If you want to say or ask questions, please go ahead.
Hey, Professor, I wanted to ask, does Mexico and the Latin American countries provide minimum price supports for agricultural product? Because that's an effective way to keep the market share, spread out, right? Minimum price supports help out the small farmers, make sure they get a minimum price for their agricultural products. Do they have those a lot?
They have been in place and they have gone, depending on the administration in place. And also depending on the resources, because to guarantee, I think what you're talking about, if I understand your question, Sandeep, is guaranteed price. So the idea is because agriculture by nature is a very unstable sector. You're talking about weather, you're talking about international prices, you're talking about plagues and animals and all of these things. Very few insurance companies want to get into this business. This is not like insurance, providing insurance for a manufacturing company where prices are more stable, where they don't depend on many uncontrollable factors like the weather, earthquakes, fires, storms. Anyway, so in many countries like the US and in Mexico at some extent in the past, there is this so-called guaranteed price, so that if the price goes below a certain level, the government is going to pay you for the difference. So the idea is to provide some stability. But when that happens, sometimes the governments have to inject a significant amount of resources to keep the price, to keep the income of the farmers at a minimum level, such that, it's just not sustainable. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of farmers, at least in the case of Mexico, and sometimes the governments cannot do that. At least remember, Latin American economies are not the US economy, where we can spend trillions of dollars, literally trillions of dollars in the farm bill. There is no such a thing in Latin America. No capability to do that, Sandeep.
All right. Just because you were talking about the wheat issue, about how they've created a duopoly, and I was just thinking about how, maybe minimum price supports can help out other corporations from getting into that, because that's just what I was thinking. And I mean, Mexico has a lot of products though that are heavily used in the U.S. Like, I mean, they can't, like take advantage of exporting avocados or exporting beer. Because those are like the two main products, that Mexico has an advantage of. I know you said they don't have money to subsidize it, but there's no other effective tactic that they can use.
Yes. Okay. You're right. I mean, there is some success stories like the avocados or tomatoes or beer, which is huge, right? Like Coronas and others. No, you're absolutely right. So yeah, there are some success stories, and you have to keep in mind that although I'm using Mexico as the example in this class, we're talking about the whole context in Latin America. So there is Honduras, Ecuador, and other Central American countries that don't have these success stories. So fortunately for some Mexicans, you have some of these success stories, but get this, and this is another of the challenges for ag. Typically, the success stories like beer, avocado, and tomato, unfortunately, Sandeep, these stories are not created by peasant farmers. They are not created in traditional farming. No. These success stories are successes because typically the growers and the people behind these major operations, successful operations, are multinational corporations. They operate under the Mexican name, buy avocados from Mexico. You remember that song, right, from the commercials? But in many cases, they are using just the image. This is marketing. This is a whole, operation that is using the national symbols, the colors, the names, the language, to appear Mexican. But in many of these cases, they are not producing benefits for the local peasant traditional farmer. So that's the other thing that you need to keep in mind. And again, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. All I'm saying is that this is not a good way to redistribute wealth and income in the Mexican economy, when just a few companies can claim these success stories because they have access to the marketing channels, the distribution channels, they have access to capital, to technology, they speak the business language, they actually speak English, which obviously the traditional farmers do not. And that's how they lose on these opportunities that NAFTA and other treaties can provide. Mm-hmm. Good question, Sandeep. Cody, you have your hand up.
Yeah, at the beginning of the lecture, you mentioned how a lot of the times the failings are always pointed out of current sort of economic systems, but there's not really alternatives that are mentioned. I was wondering if maybe you could offer some alternatives or put some alternatives out there that are maybe suggested, because I mean, NAFTA sort of showcases that the larger, more developed countries are the beneficiaries of most, if not all, the benefits of these kinds of agreements. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if maybe you could tell us about any sort of ideas that maybe go around in Latin American countries and Mexico in particular that are sort of a way for them to get away from these types of agreements, given that they sort of, I think we've talked about it a lot in this class, where they feel kind of forced into these agreements because
yeah. Well,
what are their other options?
Well, let me say this, and I'm running out of time, and I have to be respectful of that. But let me say this: I am a firm believer of markets. I think markets are one of the most wonderful machines that human beings have ever invented. But this assumes the right conditions. This assumes that what we preach is actually practice. Let me explain this. So when I say, what do I mean by conditions? What are the necessary conditions? Well, we need to have the institutional infrastructure in place. Like the example I gave with the lack of antitrust regulations. You cannot expect a well-functioning market when there is nobody policing it, when there is no institutions safeguarding that nobody is monopolizing anything, right? That's one. And you know, the conditions. Now, preaching. We in the rich countries like the US, we are trying to convince the rest of the world that they need to open up their economies, to reduce tariffs, to let capital enter their countries. But guess what? We don't do that. We preach what we don't practice. And that's so unfair to the rest of the world, because we are leading the pack and we are telling them, if you do what I'm telling you, you're going to become something like me. You know, this idea of linear development that I don't think is right. So I don't know if this is I am addressing your question, Cody, because I don't have the silver bullet to answer this question. All I'm saying is that I think we may be in the right track if the conditions were right, if the institutional arrangements were in place, and if we were actually being fair with the rest of the world. And I don't think that's happening. Yeah.
I agree with that point. In terms of the institutional arrangements and the regulation, I'm not sure, at least in my mind, I'm not sure there's a basis for that argument that Mexico and other Latin American countries need to find a way to break up these monopolies. I mean, because the whole idea is based on, I guess, is based on our systems of sort of Sherman antitrust. And I mean, I would argue, and I don't think anybody could really argue with me about it, that doesn't work, because we live in the Amazon and Google world. So
yeah. All right, I'm out of time, guys. I'm gonna stop here, Cody. We can pick up this on conversation on Wednesday, okay? So I am going to stop recording.